American politics, and by extension Western politics, since 2015 have circulated around one man. That, of course, being the Orange Man. The Trump presidency has shifted the direction of the right wing away from neoconservatism towards populism. Despite this, the core beliefs of Trumpism are still not very clear. In this video, we will imagine a Trumpist utopia to try to find out what stands at the root of this movement and why it has defined the politics of the last decade. Before we begin with the vision of an ideal future that Trumpism has, we have the unenviable task of defining what Trumpism even is. This is difficult because it is a very young and idiosyncratic ideology that orbits around a single man. In its most basic essence, Trumpism is populism, American right-wing populism to be more precise. So in the first part of this essay, we will focus on defining populism. Populism is a strange word with two uses. The formal use is that populism is an ideology that is quote-unquote for the people, as opposed to the elites. However, the common use of populism is another way of saying demagoguery. That people have been misled and seduced by some charismatic leader. I believe that populism and democracy are actually inseparable. Democracy is the idea that the people, the demos, should have the power, the kratos. And the formal definition of populism that you would find in a dictionary is the idea that the government should serve, quote-unquote, the people. Both of these definitions are describing the same thing. The only difference is the amount of Greek used. Why then are these two words treated so differently? Very simple. Populism is used as a way of saying bad democracy, while good democracy is just called democracy. And who gets to decide which is which? Well, that would be the political establishment. The movements that are considered populist are popular movements that pose a threat to this very same political establishment, while the movements that benefit the political establishment are, of course, democratic and upstanding. I will not go deeper into this contradiction since I already have made an essay about it here. Two good examples of this are Occupy Wall Street and Trumpism itself. They have practically nothing in common other than the fact that they are both popular and they both go against the economic and political status quo. Therefore, they are both quote-unquote populist. If we look at the second definition of populism, it is that populism is demagoguery. It is seducing and misleading people. Indeed, we see this all around us. In elections, all sides try to win over the masses with rhetoric and vague promises to fix all the problems under the sun. In that sense, all candidates, to a greater or lesser extent, are populist. Trumpism is a populist movement, but so is social democracy and socialism, and practically all popular ideologies, because there is no way to win an election without rabble-rousing. In all democratic systems, popularity determines political power, and the best way to achieve it is through lies and promises, through quote-unquote populism. Indeed, is there one example of a democracy where demagoguery has not come to dominate? The issue with this is that it will lead us to the conclusion that populism and democracy are not only two sides of the same coin, but synonyms. So when we want to talk about Trumpism, the key to a good analysis is not to talk about quote-unquote populism, but about how right-wing democratic politics work. Because like it or not, Trumpism is a democratic movement. Trump himself can barely control his own party and has no institutional power. Without his supporters, he is nothing. So, democratic politics are not extremely complex. In elections, candidates and policy are not determined by ideology, but by issues. Issues are political questions that are easy to explain and have two clearly defined sides, such as abortion, immigration, social justice, etc. The reason that issues are so important to democratic politics is that they are the most effective way to mobilize supporters because everybody can understand them and they bring out the passions of the crowd. In contrast, we have political theory, which is mostly dry and uninteresting. Almost nobody reads the party manifestos, and much less the actual political theory, because ideological considerations do not win elections. What wins elections are easily understandable and controversial topics that will emotionally appeal to the lowest common denominator. Democracy forces all parties and all ideologies to simplify themselves into a list of issues. There are many single-issue parties that do not have a complete ideology outside of one single issue, such as the Brexit Party. In my humble opinion, the power of large democratic parties does not come from a coherent ideology, but from a group of issues. Such parties could be called multi-issue parties. Democratic parties might have an ideology at their core, but their success and their power are a result of the issues that they embrace. That is, in my opinion, what I think Trumpism is. A group of issues that mostly align with each other instead of a coherent ideology with its own worldview. The great difference between neocons and Trumpers comes from the fact that these two movements embrace different issues when it comes to the economy and foreign intervention. With this long clarification of what Trump is, I think that we might begin imagining this utopia through the lens of the main issues that make up Trumpism. And a small disclaimer to anyone who's like, that would be unrealistic. How would you shut up? It's a utopia. It's a thought experiment. Since Trumpism is an exclusively American movement, it would be impossible to imagine any other place for this utopia other than the USA. The other factor is that this utopia would take place in the future after a Trumpist political victory. So, the first characteristic of this hypothetical country would be that it would be protectionist and to a certain degree isolationist. This would mean that this version of the United States would be focused on its own internal issues and would not get stuck in foreign involvements or be economically dependent on the outside world. This would also mean that the US would only intervene in international affairs when they would get some benefit out of it, unlike the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan that ended up costing trillions of dollars and thousands of lives for negligible benefits. This would also mean that the involvement in international organizations such as the UN would also be less than in our world. In this utopia, the United States would be an industrial powerhouse, producing and exporting rather than offshoring and importing products. This would also mean that the cities, especially those in the Rust Belt, would see an age of economic prosperity and repopulation. This economic renaissance would, in theory, fix most of the current problems that the US currently faces, and would, in a certain sense, bring back the American dream. This would be achieved by lowering taxes and using a system of tariffs to safeguard the internal market. These policies would benefit Americans and especially the middle class, that would see a time of prosperity that would resemble the suburban lifestyle of the 1960s but with modern technology. The general idea is that the economy should serve the people and the nation and not the other way around. The second factor for this utopia would be immigration, which after all was the issue that propelled Trump to national prominence. However, to say that Trump was against immigration would be incorrect. After all, legal immigration and deportations remained constant under his term. This issue was used to get attention and rally support, but little was done about the actual situation of legal and illegal immigration because A, this would hurt the economy by removing millions of workers and destroy the already negligible support from immigrant communities. Immigration in this utopia would be common, however, there would be a larger emphasis on integration into this new American dream. Immigration would only really be restricted by the concerns of the economy and falling wages. We could also come to observe a factional conflict between the majority of his base that believe that immigrants can become patriotic Americans, and a nationalist minority that believe that being American is not something that one can simply adopt. When it comes to governance, this utopia would be administered by an executive government that removes most of the current bureaucracy of typical Western democracies. This debureaucratization is an important issue for Trumpism since its base feels neglected and even betrayed by Washington, which is the origin of the idea of quote-unquote draining the swamp, which means giving power to an executive that really cares for the people. The last certain characteristic of this utopia would be a renewed sense of American exceptionalism. This is just another name for American nationalism and the belief that the US can do everything better than anybody else. In this utopia, this feeling would be common due to the economic success and the resurgence of American patriotism. On the economic side, this utopia is clear. However, the issues begin to become a little blurry when we start talking about social policy. This is because the electoral base of Trumpism is made up of very different groups that believe very different things. On one side, you would have the Christians. On another, you would have the secular factory workers. And finally, you would also have the libertarian business owners. So the only way that I can imagine such different groups coexisting with each other would be through separation. The Christians would have their own cities and neighborhoods, while the businessmen would also have their own areas where they would be able to engage in their more unchristian lifestyle, with the workers somewhere in between. So I do not believe that this utopia could have a unified social policy because real-life Trumpism is not an ideology with a defined ethical system. For example, we would come to expect that most of this society would be anti-abortion, but not for one unified and clear reason, but for a dozen different ones. So let's get back to reality. The main conclusion that we can take from imagining this utopia is that Trumpism is unified around economic issues and political reform. But besides that, there's not much that holds this ideology together, especially not on the social or ethical side. This contradiction is most blatant when you see how evangelicals praise Trump as if he was sent directly by God to redeem mankind, while in reality, Trump has lived a hardly Christian life of excess and luxury. He has married 3 times and that cheated on each one of his wives with whores. Frankly, it is a wonder that he became the face of Bible and gun conservatism. However, all of this makes sense when we see that Trumpism is a coalition and not an ideology. This is also the case with Bidenism, and frankly, with almost all the ideologies that have been coined from the name of a president or a prime minister. The reality is that democratic parties are unable to create coherent ideologies because the goal is to form a wide coalition around common symbolic issues and win as many votes as possible. I think that this is best described by Walter Lippmann in his work Public Opinion. Quote, "When political parties or newspapers declare for Americanism, progressivism, law and order, justice, or humanity, they hope to amalgamate the emotion of conflicting factions, which would surely divide if instead of these symbols, they were invited to discuss a specific program. For when a coalition around the symbol has been effected, feeling flows toward conformity under the symbol, rather than towards critical scrutiny of the measures." End quote. What I am arguing is that when we see the incoherence of Trump and all the other ideologies that come from electoral coalitions, is that this incoherence is a feature, not a bug. A certain amount of vagueness is necessary to be successful in a democratic system. If Trump, Biden, or any other candidates created a specific ideology with clear foundations, this would surely alienate a huge percentage of their base and probably cost them the election. Finally, I think that this is also the reason why Trumpism has so far achieved so little, and why I think it will lead to nowhere. The fact is that a huge amount of the political power in liberal democracies comes from universities, and in order to have an ideological presence in academia, you do need a coherent ideology, which is the reason why any university reform by the current right wing is doomed to fail. Although I dislike Marxism-Leninism or progressivism, they are internally coherent. They have a ton of theory and have a solid ethical system. This gives them the ability to win over the academics that make up the university system. These ideologies can compete at an intellectual level, while Trumpism in its current form simply cannot. I have already made a video that talks about why I think populism will end up failing. But are we not seeing the futility of trying to achieve political power without institutional power with our very own eyes? After all, Trump might be going to jail. As long as the right wing does not have a coherent and convincing ideology, it will have no institutional power. And this means that it will be on the back foot. It will continue to be a movement that exists as a meek response to the seemingly unstoppable advance of progressivism. The right wing needs an ideology that is coherent in our postmodern times, and Trumpism is not it. It has the ability to move millions, but it cannot win because it does not have the vision to do so. Perhaps one day an ideology will appear, but until then, the right wing must suffer defeat after defeat. Thank you for your time, and consider subscribing to both my Substack and my YouTube channel. I will keep making these Utopia essays, but the next one will probably be something original.